Welcome to Building Flutter, a brand new video series where we show you how to contribute to the Flutter framework yourself. Today I'm joined by Taha Tesser, who will be walking me through the setup of the Flutter SDK, the Flutter framework, so that we're able to start contributing. Taha, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, before we jump in, you'll kind of be leading me today. Even though I was previously on the Flutter team, a lot has probably changed. You'll be showing me how to get set up as a contributor to the Flutter framework. Can you tell the audience just a little bit about how you know so much about contributing to the Flutter framework?
I have been working at CodeMagic as a Flutter contributor for the last 4 years, like over 4 years. And my day job involved contributing to Flutter open source project. My focus is on the framework side. So if you use any material widgets and like samples, documentation, like I do all kinds of different contributions. Sometimes I also dabble into other areas of Flutter like Tool, Cupertino. But my primary focus is working on material design and the framework. And as part of my role, like I introduce new features, I fix bugs, I provide feedback, I review PRs, I comment on issues on a daily basis.
Okay, great. So you kind of do all the things that a typical and traditional Flutter framework developer does. So CodeMagic, they brought you on, they hired you, and they said, hey, we're going to pay you to make the Flutter framework better. Is that about right?
That's about it, yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So with that, obviously, you know what you're doing. You work on Flutter all the time. You file issues, you put up PRs, you fix bugs, you create features. So you're a great person to help us understand, us and the rest of the community understand how we can clone Flutter and start contributing to it ourselves. And so with that, let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into it. So let's say I'm a brand new developer. I'm really excited about contributing to Flutter as an open source developer. What's the first step?
Let's go over a couple of scenarios. The most common scenario would be a developer who is working at a job, or they have their own machine. They will usually have a Flutter stable version installed on their system. And when they have this version, sometimes they tend to make mistakes by editing the source code of this SDK that is downloaded from the website. It's not from the GitHub, it's from the Flutter website. And they make a mistake to edit the source code, and they try to push those changes somehow to the GitHub repository. And they run into problems. Like I know some people who try to contribute and they say, oh, like I have modified, but I don't know how to push these changes. So in this video, we're gonna be talking about how you can have a fork setup of Flutter SDK that's not your stable version of Flutter SDK, where you would use on a daily basis for your job, for your projects, for anything, for studies. But in order to contribute to open source, you'd have to think of a Flutter setup that is different from what you regularly use on a daily basis. So
okay, so what I've got here, so just so the audience knows what they're seeing on the screen, this is my regular Flutter configuration. So I have one Flutter installation on my machine. Like you said, I followed the directions on the website to install Flutter. Every time that I run a build of a Flutter app, it's using these files that you see right before you on my computer, and you're saying we want a separate version of Flutter so that when we start working on it, we don't ruin the main version that we use for all of our other apps and packages. Is that right?
Yes, ideally, because you could theoretically still use this setup, but if you're working with a stable channel, you have to switch to the master channel, which is where the Flutter would merge your changes. So you have to pull master changes from the repository. Like if you switch to the repository tab to your GitHub repository, you can see the changes are much recent. They are like, some changes are like few minutes ago. So you have to work with a updated master branch on your system. So technically, you can use the same setup that you have you can add upstream git remote to this repository, because typically when you download, it doesn't have a upstream git remote to send your code to the GitHub repository. You need to have a fork, you need to have a origin and a remote. We can talk about that a little bit later. And you could technically still use the setup, but I wouldn't recommend this for almost anyone, because you're working with a stable channel. You need that channel on a daily basis, and you're not contributing as often as me. Like, I only have master branch, I don't have stable. And like, when you make changes to this, you have to switch between master and stable. And sometimes you could run into issues where, okay, I need to work on an important bug in my project for my work or for my project, and I'm accidentally on master, and I tried to do something with my code, and I see a bunch of errors, or I see like bunch of new APIs showing up in my code, and you would panic. You would like, then you would realize, I was on master branch, I was not on stable. I should be on stable to work with my code. So in that case, pretty much for everyone, I would say you need to have a separate copy. It should be very simple and straightforward, and you will not touch this master branch unless you need to contribute. And you will only modify that version, not your stable version.
Okay, yeah, let's do it. So so obviously I have the GitHub repo for Flutter pulled up here. Is the first step to come over here and clone this repo?
No, the first step would be to fork it to your GitHub account, and you will clone your fork. So this is the Flutter/Flutter, which is the main repository. When you clone it, it will become part of your account. It would say your username, then /Flutter. You need to clone your own fork. Okay. So when you go to click fork and you fork it to your account.
I may already have a fork. In fact, I probably do, but let's...
No, it's fine. You go to your fork.
Well, I was thinking it's super far behind. Maybe we should just fork it fresh. So let me say...
No, we can update it. You can go to your fork and update it.
I understand. I'd like for the audience to see what they're going to see, though.
Yeah.
But it's still okay. So that's weird. So even if I give it a different name, GitHub still says, "Hey, you've already got it."
Yeah.
Well, okay. Then I guess we're going
to. There are ways to do that. There are ways to you can get a repository into your account with a custom name, but we don't need to do that right now.
Okay, so imagine that we went through the forking process that you just saw. This is what you'd be looking at. Now, you in the audience, you'd already be up to date. Mine is way out of date. It's 5 years old. So I'm going to click sync fork. All right, and I'm going to say update branch. Okay, and so just like
that. It is important to know that you have just updated only your master branch, not your other branches of your fork. So if you imagine you fork this, clone this repository to your local system, your other branches will still be outdated, but not the master branch.
We'll go to beta. Beta is where about every month or so, the Flutter team releases to beta to prove things out. And then there's also, of course, stable, which is where most projects, actually, is stable not tagged in here?
Probably not, yeah. I don't see it.
That's interesting. Do they just do release tags? Let's see. What's over here? Okay, so it looks like perhaps there's no stable branch. There are only stable tags, maybe. In any event, master and beta, those are definitely branches for you to know about and to keep those synced. But I think we're going to develop on master because that's where all new changes go into Flutter. So
that's right, yeah.
So Taha, I now have a fork of Flutter in my personal GitHub account. So now we want to go over here and clone this, right?
Yes. Step 1, done. Fork the repository. If you already forked it, but you didn't contribute, like a lot of people fork and they forget repositories. They tend to forget fork just out of curiosity, and they don't do anything with that. So it's pretty common for people to have fork repositories. So in your case, you updated it. And now we can clone it. So normally, if you clone the GitHub repository, it will add origin because your account will be part of that clone. And GitHub will say, okay, you are cloning from your account, so I'm going to add remote origin, which is your own origin. and it's not going to add upstream origin.
Let's clone it, and then we can actually go in the terminal and we can show the origin that you're talking about, just so everyone's crystal clear. So I'll come over here. I'll open a term. Now what I've done is, in my case, I've chosen a directory on my machine that's near the root. This, you can see Flutter, Google SDK, Chrome driver. This is where I stick developer libraries and things that I need in other projects. So from here, I thought I was going to be able to open a tab. Maybe I have to come in here and terminal, I mean. All right, here's a terminal. So I'm going to go back up a directory. So now I'm here, and then I'm going to say git clone, and I'm going to create a Flutter. Actually, I should probably make the directory first. I don't know if Git will do that. So we will make directory Flutter dev. Then I will git clone into Flutter dev.
That's smart, yeah. That's a good idea because you're cloning in the same root directory as your regular Flutter folder.
Yeah. By the way, do you know the quick key on a Mac to increase the font size here? I'm sure people can't see what I'm typing.
Command plus, like I just typed Command plus. Okay,
interesting.
Yeah, then you resize your window because it also increases the window size.
The whole window bigger. Okay. All right. Well, so you can see here now, hopefully on the video, git clone. I just put in the URL from GitHub, and then I specify the directory. And then back here in flutter-dev, my new directory, here's an entire copy of Flutter. Again, file structure similar to the existing one, right? There's a little bit of a difference here, but not much. So this is essentially the same thing that we already had, but now it's a copy. Now we can mess with it. And all right, Taha, what's the next step? Should we check out the origin that you're talking about?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so we'll do git remote. Is it dash v list?
Just dash v. Yeah. You're not in the folder.
Yep. Got it. Go into flutter-dev, git remote v. Okay, so there's this thing called origin. Now, origin is just a name. You can have any remote name you want, but origin is the default. It's the standard. And what this is saying is that whenever we try to pull down updates from quote remote, or wherever we try to push updates to it, this is the actual Git repository that we're talking to. And this is my copy. So Taha, is that what we want, or do we want origin to point to the real Flutter?
No, we want the origin to point to your forked Flutter repository, because when you make changes, you're pushing to your own copy of which is your own fork, and then you click open PR from your repository to the Flutter repository. Then whatever changes you make in your branch will be merged into master branch, because you can't directly edit and make changes to the upstream, which is what the main repository is, like Flutter/Flutter. But in this case, we make changes to Matthew Carroll /Flutter.
Got it. Okay, and do we only operate with origin, or do we add a second remote for main Flutter?
Yes, because right now, whatever changes you make are being pushed only to your repository, but also you have to consider, you have to sometime update your local branch to work with the latest branch from upstream. Right now, if you fetch, you're only fetching your origin. You're not fetching upstream. So let's just say right now you just cloned it, so your SDK is pretty latest, but after a couple of days, it'll be outdated. Your master branch will be like 20 commits behind. And sometimes you will have to, most of the time, you will have to sync your branch with the upstream repository, which in this case would be Flutter/Flutter. So the very first step would be, and I can give you another tip. If you use GitHub CLI, if you open the website for users, maybe they can see it. GitHub CLI is my favorite tool for this, because GitHub CLI not only make it easy to clone your own repository or the upstream repository, but also when you clone, if you go to documentation manual on the top right, if you go to repo, there should be a repo on the left. If you Control F repo, you can clone your own repository. So when you clone it, git gh repo clone, the second command. Yeah. So what this does is essentially what you already did with git clone and then your SSH link. You use the SSH link, so when you do that, it only adds origin. But what GitHub CLI does is, because you're using your GitHub account to log in into the CLI tool, and you can manipulate your repositories, you can push changes, you can review comments if you want. There are so many features in this CLI. And I use this because when I clone using GitHub CLI, it not only adds origin, it also adds upstream, because it checks my GitHub account, because this is the GitHub CLI. So it checks, okay, this is the origin link, and then it says, okay, this is this is fork from this upstream repository. So it also adds that automatically. So I don't have to do the manual process. In fact, I don't even remember the exact command right now to add upstream. But okay, let's add this for our users.
Let's so we'll leave that as a tool for people to check out. I think it's always good to also see what's really happening under the hood. I think what we can say is git remote add upstream, and my guess is we're going to say git at github.com flutter/flutter.git. Let's see.
That was good, but that was good. But you're an expert, so you can type that link. But I was gonna say, like, you type git remote add upstream, then you can copy the SSH link from Flutter repository, so you don't have to remember the whole thing.
Yeah. So let's make that really. Yeah. You don't have to remember those URLs. So if we go to flutter/flutter, this is the regular Flutter now. This is the real thing.
Yeah.
If you click this green code button, this right here is the same thing that I just typed. This URL is what you add as the upstream. And again, upstream could be anything, but in this case, upstream just means the real project that the actual Flutter team is working on. They're adding commits every few minutes, and we want to be able to pull their new work into our copy. And that's what this URL here is for. So going back to what I typed, I typed git remote. So we're going to add a new remote repository. We're going to call it upstream. Could be called whatever you want. We're going to call it upstream. And then this was the URL that I typed in, which we could otherwise just copy directly from GitHub. But now we have two remote repositories. We have the one that we own, and we have the real Flutter repository.
Yes, exactly. Now you can see that each link has fetch and push. You would often do fetch and pushing with you will push with your origin, and you will fetch from upstream. So you can sync the latest changes from the upstream repository and then make changes to your fork. And the idea is to have a latest copy of the upstream branch, in this case master, and then make changes to it and update your fork. Then your fork and the upstream would have everything up to date and until one commit or two commits when you make the actual changes. So right now, if you open your fork, it will say like everything is latest, like it's matching, right? But when you make changes for the PR, everything would be up to date except one commit ahead or two commit ahead. Like in the future, like we can talk about how to like update.
Why don't we show that command real quick? It's not going to make any changes, but why don't we do one fetch from upstream and one push to origin, just so the audience knows what those commands are.
Yeah, you can fetch like from upstream, git fetch upstream. I'm not sure because I don't use CLI.
Let's see. So right now, let's see what branch we're on. So if we check, we are on our master.
Yeah.
So now it has been a long time since I've actually done this routine, because usually I'm working directly on packages that I own and control. So I can do everything on one branch. I don't actually know how to, let's see, if we git pull upstream master, let's see if that breaks things or not.
You're up to date. You need to fetch because CLI don't automatically fetch the latest data.
Well,
then
git pull actually includes a fetch.
Okay.
So git pull I think is like a fetch and a merge. Yeah. We can say git fetch upstream. This tells our local repo like what the latest commits are.
Yeah.
So it pulled like all the, I guess it doesn't pull tags by default. So now we have all the tags, but we can, so now we locally know all the latest stuff in the real Flutter, And we can try again. We can say git pull upstream. So we're pull stuff, take stuff from the real Flutter, and
you can say
apply
master. Yeah.
Yeah, and then apply it to our local master. Now again, already up to date because no one on the Flutter team has merged a commit since we set this up a few minutes ago. But once you do the git pull upstream master, let's say you make some changes on your version, you can then say git push origin master. Everything's up to date again because we haven't made any changes. But those two commands, pull from upstream, push to origin, that's going to be a common thing to do. So, okay, so with a bunch of that git stuff figured out, what's next on our list, Taha?
The next thing is the command itself. Like when you are running tests, when you're running your project, or when you open your IDE, you need to know like which version of the Flutter SDK you're working with. So your IDE needs to know which Flutter to sync it with, because when you're making changes to the source code, you're using Flutter to make you run tests with Flutter. So it uses itself to test it. So let's say if you go to this folder, your setup, right now, your default Flutter command, which is flutter Dr. V, would point to your regular Flutter, not the new one. New one is not used anywhere. You just cloned it. So if you type flutter doctor and see the output, it should say Flutter stable channel.
How about we do a Flutter version?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is pointing to your regular Flutter version. How do we know that?
And by the way, there's another way we can say which Flutter.
Yes.
And you can see that it's pointing to devlibs/Flutter, not Flutter dev, just Flutter. So not Flutter dev, just Flutter. It's pointing to my original installation. We want to be able to, in some cases, run Flutter from the new installation.
Exactly. And this is what is important. Like right now, like you need to keep everything as it is with Flutter command. You should not like modify this because you will be using it for your regular development. But we still want to be able to also use Flutter's -dev with a command to tell our IDE that, okay, I want to modify some code. It could be your own project. It could be a sample project. It could be the actual Flutter -dev with its own command. So in this case, there are so many ways to do this. Like some people use FVM, which is Flutter Version Manager. I don't personally use it for various reasons that we can't go into right now. Some people use some other ways. But what I do is the simplest way on a Mac OS and Linux OS system is pretty simple. I just use alias to call whatever custom fork I have. So instead of having regular command like pointing to my flutter-dev, I use another alias with a different name. Alias is just a same Flutter command, but you can call it whatever you want. You can call it Michael, and Michael Dr-V. It will point to your flutter-dev. Just saying. And what this does is it will only run your flutter-dev with this command. And when you sync a project, a sample project, because when you're working with bugs, you will be running a sample project, or the flutter-dev itself, when you run Flutter command in this SDK, it will tell that, okay, point to this SDK, which is flutter-dev. So now this is good. We don't need to modify this, but we will go to your zshell RC file. And you can set a new alias.
I'm gonna hide that because I can't remember if I have some passwords or secrets in mind. But why don't we type the line out right here, and then I will move it on my other monitor into that environment file. So what would that line be that we're gonna add?
Yes, because I'm only using master, but for this video, I set this alias so that we can tell our viewers like how to do this. So I will send you this line. It's pretty simple. The same line as your regular Flutter, but instead of just bin, we say the actual Flutter. How can I send you the link? Okay, yeah, I can send you it here. So what this does is it sets an alias to the fork SDK. And in this case, we're just using some other keyword to call this flutter-dev.
Okay, so let me remove the comment so we don't confuse them there. That's just a comment, doesn't do anything. So the format here is alias, that's the operating system command, and then F, that's what you want to call it. So I'm going to call it.
You can call it whatever you want.
I'm going to call it Flutter Dev. So it's Flutter plus the word dev, and then this is your path. I've got to change it to mine. You'll notice that right up above this, I did pwd, print working directory. That's the path we need to use. So for me, it's going to be users Matt devlibs flutter-dev. Now we could run this line right here, and in fact, we will. And if I say which Flutter dev, it shows that it's an alias. The problem is if we close this terminal and open another terminal, or we open the IDE and we have a terminal, it's going to forget this alias. That's why.
Now,
go ahead.
There is a problem with this because you're pointing to the root folder, which is flutter-dev, but it doesn't mean it's actually executing the Flutter file.
You're right. So let's point this out to the audience too while we're here. So again, here we are in the distribution. There's a bin directory, and in the bin directory are executables. This is compiled code that you can run, and you'll notice that in there is Dart and Flutter. So Taha, I assume that what we want is bin/Flutter. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll take the same command I had a moment ago, except we're going to say bin/Flutter. And then I can say which Flutter dev, that points to the path. And now we can, in fact, verify it by saying Flutter dev version. And now it's downloading the engine because that's a separate binary that isn't part of the source code of the framework. In fact, there's 2 different repositories on GitHub. But once it downloads the engine and updates that background stuff, we should see the version output. And it should be, we expect to be on channel master, because everything we've done with our GitHub so far has been on master. So we'll give it a moment here to do that. Okay, and we're back. So after that engine thing got downloaded in the background, which you don't really need to understand right now, we end up with this text here at the bottom. Let me add some blank lines in here. You'll see that it's Flutter 3.22.0, channel master. It's referencing my personal GitHub. Revision 28 minutes ago. So that's clearly what we expected. And what that means, again, is that every time that we type Flutter dev, it's like the same thing as typing Flutter, except it points to our personal version, which we can change and update. Okay, Taha, we have our version. Actually, let me alias that in the environment folder.
Yeah.
To be clear what that means, if you're on a Mac, or I don't know about Windows, but Mac and Linux, there's a file, a script that is run every time you log into your machine or every time you start it up. So anything that you want to always initialize, you can do it in that environment file. That's where I update my path to include Flutter, to include the Android SDK, to include various SSH keys. It's all in that file. I'm going to add this alias to that file too. I'm going to add, where was it? This line right here. So I will do that on the other screen. And while I do that, Taha, feel free to, if you want to introduce where we're going next, by all means.
Yeah. What this does is it's pointing to the Flutter dev folder. So when we use this command, or this alias rather, it's pointing to the Flutter-dev Flutter version. When you use this command to run, let's just say pubget in a project, like a sample project, when you create, it tells that project that I want to point to this version of SDK where it is inside Flutter Dev. And from that point, if you run that project, your IDE will use Flutter Dev to run your project instead of your stable version. And that's very important because when you make changes, you need to be able to test those changes using the version that you modify. Like if I make some changes to my Flutter Dev, like for example, if I go into a class for a widget and I, let's just say, add a new parameter or fix something in that widget, when I run the project, my project has to point to that particular Flutter setup. So I can sync those changes and actually test it. So this is very important for that. And then when you run test, you will be using this command, or your IDE will use the location provided by this command. And it will not be changed until you run regular Flutter command, which you won't do if you're testing only master. So like you can switch between both commands. It's up to you. Like if you have a sample project and you want to test it on master, see if your bug fixes the issue, then you can run regular command, regular Flutter run, and it will run your project in the stable channel. So you have the ability to run your code on a stable and master at the same time without having to modify your Flutter setup.
Okay, so I added that alias to my environment file, and what I did here, you'll notice I opened a new tab. All this junk here is rerunning what's in there. So now in this new tab, normally the alias would be gone because it only exists in the one tab that you set it, but I can now say flutter dev -- version, and it still finds Flutter and it still gives me the version, which means from now on, everywhere I go, I can type flutter dev and I will run my own version of Flutter.
That's right. Perfect.
Okay. What's next?
Now we can create a sample project to show how that sample project would use Flutter dev instead of regular Flutter. So this is important to test our changes, which we make in the next video or in the future. But let's create a new sample project. Using Flutter dev command, you can use both, but I would recommend Flutter dev so you have the master branch project to test master branch changes.
Okay, we'll go up a directory and then we'll go to Flutter sample. And so what you're saying is that in here, in the Flutter sample, I'm going to give us some more room, we want to say Flutter create. And there are a few options that we're going to need to specify here. So one of them is T for template, which we want an app, right? What other options do we want to pass at this point?
We can omit this because the template is default. The app template is default, so you don't need to specify.
Okay.
And you're using Flutter command. So
you're right.
that will
So
create the
Flutter,
project with the stable.
Right. Got it. So Flutter dev create.
You can,
Are there any other
say
flags that
sample.
you want?
Yes, sample. You can call it, this would be a project name, so you can call it sample or test, anything you want.
Well, so we've already got the directory here, so I'm guessing that we can just say dot to use the current directory, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if you want to
Okay.
put it in the same folder. So what this is doing is this is creating this is basically creating a new project inside this folder.
So it's going to complain. Okay, so in Dart and Flutter, you can't have dashes and names for some reason. So I'll come back. Actually, let me first get out of that directory. I'll come back here. I will rename to Flutter _ sample. Then we will go back into Flutter _ sample. And now I'm going to rerun Flutter dev create in the current working directory. Let's try that again.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, and so now if we look back at the files, under Flutter sample now, we have a totally normal Flutter project, but it was created with the latest version of Flutter from our local master. And we can do something, for example, like we can say Flutter test. There's always a one or two, I pressed the wrong thing again. I got to get used to that. Flutter dev test. That's going to run the default do nothing tests that come with every Flutter project. They passed. So what this verifies is that we were able to compile essentially our new sample Flutter app, and we were able to run the tests of our sample Flutter app. Now, this is not to be confused with building actual Flutter or testing actual Flutter. This is just our sample app. So, okay. Now, Taha, did you want us to open the sample app in the IDE for any reason, or do you just want to verify that we're able to build and test?
Yes, you run this command like Flutter dev to run the test. And you could run this command, use this command to run the app as well. So I want to show like you can run the project and then we can look into one particular folder after we open this project. Let's run the app one time.
So I don't have any emulator or simulator, so let's see if it'll launch in Chrome.
hopefully it will do. So while this is running, you can also, it's actually pretty quick.
It says it's launching.
Yeah.
Okay. So here it is. Here's the app that we just created. This is what you see by default. If you haven't created a sample app in a while, this might look different. This is, as Taha knows very well, this is all Material 3 stuff these days. But this is our app, in fact, running in the browser. If we had an Android emulator open, we could run on that. If we had an iOS simulator open, we could run on that. We could also run it as a Mac desktop app, Linux, Windows, but browser was the fastest.
That's right.
Okay.
So now we can open this project and we can look into a couple of things that are important to consider.
Okay. I'm going to open from my other IDE here. So I use Android Studio. We're going to give that a try here today. I'm going to find it over here. I'm going to say trust the project, open it in a new window, and here we are. Now actually there's two things that we should do here right off the bat, Taha. One of them is to increase the font size for the people watching. So let's see, settings, font size. Go like size 20. Okay, now the terminal might still be small. I'm not sure if that's a different
It's okay,
font
we can
size
still
control.
use our regular terminal.
Okay, and so I'll also show the files here. These are the files. I want everything to be bigger, but it's like all controlled by different settings. So we don't want to see this as an Android project. We want to see it as a Flutter project. And then the second thing, now the second thing doesn't matter so much for our sample project, but Taha, if I remember correctly, Flutter itself does not actually follow standard Dart language formatting. Is that right?
Yeah, that will come later because in your project, you can do whatever you want.
Right. It will be later, but before I forget, see, I have automatic formatting turned on. I have Dart format in here. And somewhere in here, it's going to say autosave, I think. See, allow, perform. So, no, it's hot reload. I'm sorry. Where is it? Format code on save. This right here is great for your own projects, but it's going to create a lot of pain in the Flutter framework. The Flutter framework does not follow standard formatting. So if you automatically format every time you save a file, every file that you open in the Flutter framework, you're going to totally reformat it. And then you're going to change one line and you're going to end up with 1,000 lines of change. So we're going to turn off the format on save. Now, it doesn't matter for my project, but it matters for the Flutter framework. So say, okay. But all right, so now we're back at this default Flutter project that we've generated.
Yeah. So a couple of things to consider. Because we used Flutter Dev to create this project is not going to use your stable version of Dart. It will use a edge version or like a latest version that's higher than your stable version. So what this this is perfectly normal for master branch, but when you try to run the same project on a stable, it says, oh, this version is not supported. So what you should do is you should have a SDK version, the Flutter SDK version, or Dart SDK version pointing to stable version. So in this case, it's pointing to 3.5.0 dev. This is going to be unsupported on stable. So what I usually do is, in my sample project, I always use the stable Dart SDK because when we are contributing to Flutter framework, we are not actually worried about a particular version of Dart. It's like in some cases it might matter, but it's very rare. So you are safe to use a stable version. So what I do is I go to...
Do we just remove this part here, or do we have to look up the number?
It's better to look up, so you're up to date with the stable one, so your project still runs on a stable version.
Okay. So where do we find that number?
We go to flutter.dev. get started. You can choose whatever version. We just need to look at SDK version. Choose a platform. Scroll down. You can see SDK archive somewhere there.
SDK.
Maybe, SDK archive.
It doesn't seem to find anything. How about archive?
In the scroll up a little bit. There will be a link there. SDK archive somewhere. Oh, download and install. This is actually VS Code installation. I saw the other day. If you scroll up a little bit, you switch to download and install. Now you will see SDK archive. Little bit up, below the blue button, Here you can see all the stable and beta version. You can actually Google this directly. I took a long route for this, but here you can see the current stable version, the latest one, is using Dart 3.3.3. So what this tells is like you will be fine if you run the sample project on the stable version or on master, you will be fine. But if you run 3.5, this dev version on a stable, it will not work.
Okay, so we'll save that, and we'll also do a pub get to let it make whatever adjustments it wants to make there.
Yeah, the second thing I wanted to show is like when you did pub dev, what it is doing actually, it should be running this pub dev from your Flutter dev version, but you just did it. So how do we know it is actually doing Flutter dev from your Flutter dev version? We can tell, you can go there, but also you can go to Dart tool. There is a folder there, Dart tool in your project. On the left.
So
there will be a version folder.
Version.
So this version folder tells like you're pointing to this version. This is not
our,
clearly
now
your stable version.
Just to be clear, since we did just change to Dart version 3.3.3, this is not the Dart version. So is this the Dart version or is this the Flutter version?
Flutter version. Like when you run Flutter dev doctor or Flutter dev version.
That's what I was expecting. So this is the version of Flutter, not the version of Dart, and this is obviously our master version. This is not what a stable version of Flutter would look like if it had a number.
Yes. So because when you this is important. Like when you have this sample project, let's just say you created this sample project on master branch. You're using master branch to test this, and when you run pub-get, even from UI in your IDE, this is already using your master branch because it knows from this context that my Dart tool version folder is pointing to this. There is another folder somewhere here that point to your location where the Flutter dev is actually located. So these files tells your IDE that I want to use this version and this is where it is located. I don't know which file is that exactly, but there is a file there that will tell your IDE, in this case Android Studio, or if you're using VS Code, it will tell your IDE that I'm using this particular version, and when I run pub-get or when I execute pub-get from my IDE, use this version. So now what we're going to do is we have synced our project YAML file to 3.3 just so that in future we can run this project on a stable branch. And we know that currently our project is actually synced with Flutter dev. You inspect it from CLI, you inspect it from the file. Most of the time you won't need to do it. You will remember what last command you have run. So now I want you to close this project, close your IDE, and then run this, when you open this project from terminal, instead of Flutter dev, you type Flutter pub get. So that will sync your project with a stable branch this time, not instead of master. And this should not throw any error, but it actually does because it says current version is 3.3. Your stable version is probably not the latest one with 3.3.3. You're probably using a little bit older version. If you look at the website, it's right behind the terminal. So 3.3 is actually pointing to the release number. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see the 3.3.1, 3.3.3. Yeah. So your version is probably 3.19. You can actually confirm by typing Flutter version. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
okay. And I probably shouldn't mess with that because I may have some client projects that actually are
That's
a bit
the
behind
idea.
on stable.
Yeah,
So
that's the idea.
Yeah.
You should
so
sync with, instead of instead of updating your stable channel, sync your sample project with the particular version. In this case, I said 3.3.3, assuming you would have latest stable. But if you don't have, you're fine to use 3.3.0 as well, or like 3.0.0. It's fine, completely fine.
Okay, so we'll do 3.3.0,
Yeah.
and then we'll come back here and we'll say, sorry, what was it? Flutter? What did we just run?
Flutter pub get, just regular Flutter pub get. Yeah.
Okay, because that's using the real Flutter, not our version of Flutter.
Yes, because
Okay.
you might need to change test changes on the stable channel just to verify that whatever changes it's making are actually like verified. You can test on a stable. Something could be different than your master branch, so you could test both versions of your sample project.
Now, it is interesting that Flutter pub get for me is not completing. It's hanging here at the bottom. Okay, there it finally went through. Okay, cool. All right, that sounds good. So yeah, the overall point here is that you're going to be working with real Flutter on real apps at the same time that you're actually altering Flutter with sample apps, and you want to be able to do all those things from the same computer without a big headache. What we just went over is how you can do that, how you can have real Flutter, real apps, your development Flutter with sample apps.
That's right. Now you can actually verify this. You don't have to, but just for fun, you can actually open the same version file in your sample project, and you can see it will point to your stable version now instead of the master version, just to verify this.
Yeah, and what that means is that if I use the default IDE capabilities to run this, it's going to run it not using our version of Flutter, but the real version of Flutter. So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
So best practice is to just use different command to run pubget, then open IDE, so your IDE will know which version of Flutter to use. That's what I do. It could be different from you, but whenever I open my project, if I want to use a different channel or even different branch, for example, I run pubget so that my IDE knows which version to point to.
Got it. And I think probably up here in the run configuration, let's see, we also probably want this to use we want these to use flutter dev as the command, right?
No, we don't need to do that. Like we already told
because of this version, it'll pick it up.
Yes.
Okay.
There is another file, like I'm forgetting where it is. It actually has the location of the SDK, but you don't need to worry about that. As long as you run the correct command and pubget, you're fine. And since we have our SDK separated, you don't need to worry about running wrong command. You can always switch to the correct command. Like if you want to test on stable, change the command. If you want to switch to master branch, change the command. That's it.
Got it. Okay, cool. So are we in a position yet to actually get into the Flutter framework, or is there still more to look at in the sample app?
Yeah, we are ready to go into Flutter stable, Flutter framework. But okay, so this is the sample project. We are done with it. Now, what we want to do is we want to modify our Flutter dev branch.
So this Flutter distribution. Yep.
Yeah. So there are a few things to consider here, because when you work with a stable branch, you don't really worry about the actual structure of the Flutter SDK. But when you're modifying it, you need to know where is what, and you need to know which correct packages, because Flutter SDK itself is just a collection of packages. So you need to know which package to edit and where to run the Flutter pub command, because we're going to be running it in the SDK itself. So what I recommend is open this Flutter dev in terminal, and you can run alias.
Trying to get us some larger sizes for the audience here. Okay, so you want us to be in terminal. So yes. We will have a new terminal at folder. I'll get rid of the previous one. This one needs to be larger as well. We are now in a terminal in the actual our custom Flutter SDK. All right, and what would you like to do in the terminal?
Now we can run ls just to see the structure from the terminal perspective. We already know the structure from
Yeah.
the Finder.
And I'll
but
do LA, so we also get all the private stuff that's hidden in here too, because there's some visible stuff, there's some hidden stuff.
No, we don't need to do all of that. Like we can just run ls because I want to show the different folders because we don't need to see the other files. Yeah. So here you can see there are some files and there are some folders. So there is the authors and readme, just standard. And then the example folder actually contains several examples.
Let's at least get it vertical.
Okay. So here you can see the example folder is a folder and dev is a folder. And then bin, we don't need to worry about that. And then there is something called packages. Like just like any other package, Flutter SDK is just a collection of packages. So when I say framework,
by the way, that's known as a mono repo. Usually, when you create a Flutter app, your Flutter app is just one package. And even if you create a library for other people to use, by default, that's just one package.
Yeah.
But Flutter itself contains many different packages all in one repository. And that's why we have this directory here called packages. All the packages are in the packages directory.
That's right. If you go to Flutterfy repository, you will see a collection of packages as well. So it's also a mono repository. So if you cd into packages, we can actually see what packages the Flutter SDK has. So here we can see there is something called Flutter, which is the actual Flutter framework package. And then there is a Flutter driver package, Flutter Goldens, Flutter tools.
Yeah, let's just again, to add some context, let's mention what each of these does. Flutter driver is used to run tests on actual devices. Flutter Goldens is used to, when you're running a widget test locally, it actually paints pixels to a file so you can compare painted pixels before and after your test. Flutter localizations is dealing with essentially language translations and things like that. Flutter test is the pack. When you write a widget test, you're actually using the Flutter test package. That testing stuff is not built into Flutter. It comes from Flutter test. Flutter tools, I don't even know what all is in there these days, probably a bunch of stuff. Web plugins are things that are specific to web that wouldn't apply to other mobile or desktop versions of Flutter. Fuchsia is, we can kind of ignore that. Integration test is kind of it still uses Flutter driver, but integration test is kind of the evolution of what used to just be Flutter driver. So integration test is how you run a test. It's how you write and run a test on an actual Android device, on an iOS device, in an actual browser, on an actual desktop, that kind of stuff. All of these are all different packages in Flutter, and they all get pieced together into the final distribution. So, okay, with that, go ahead, Taha.
That's right. We could have looked at this folder structure from the Finder, but the reason why I wanted to show it in the terminal, because when we contribute to one of these packages, which would be most of the time would be Flutter package, because that's where the material code is, that's where the Cupertino code is. We can look at the structure inside of the Flutter package. But if you are interested to contribute to other packages, like for example, integration tests or Flutter tools, you're welcome to do that. But you will need to know which package you need to open in your IDE and then make changes to that package. So for framework, let's just say if it is a Flutter widget or material widget or core widget, you would open packages. So now if you type pwd, we can see like we are inside Flutter SDK packages, but we need to go one level deep into a particular package that we are interested to contribute to. So in this case it would be Flutter packages, packages/Flutter. This is where our framework code, all the widgets, are living, and this is just a package. And you can see there is
I was going to point out the same thing. Notice we have a lib directory. Notice we have a test directory. Notice we have a pub spec.yaml, just like every other Flutter and Dart package you've ever created.
That's right. So here, when we did what we did with Flutter sample, what we did, we created the project and then we did pub-get and opened the project into our IDE. We need to do the same thing. We need to use our SDK, Flutter SDK command, in this case Flutter dev, to run pub-get inside our package, Flutter package, which you're modifying. So in this case, we will run flutter dev pub-get. So what this does is it is using flutter dev inside one of its own packages to say that, okay, I'm running this package. I'm like basically running pub-get into this package using itself. So it is using the same bin folder, bin/flutter executable to run the same pub-get inside the own folder. And now, even though it says Flutter, we are not in just regular Flutter. This is very important. We are in the Flutter dev packages /Flutter.
That's going to my regular. So I guess that's okay. Well, in the version file must be in here somewhere, right?
Yeah, but we can see the actual structure. Yeah.
So here's the Dart tool. So let's say ls la.dart tool.
Yeah.
There's the version, and then we can say probably cat Dart tool version.
Yeah.
And there's that version number again. Okay.
You should almost never. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
You should almost never run your stable command into this folder, because this is a very different version what stable is. Because
always
stable
Flutter
version
dev in our case here.
Yes, because this particular version is at least a couple of months ahead of what you have in the stable version. So even if you did by mistake, you should immediately type flutter dev just so that any changes are not like modified, even though most of the time it will not, but you can git reset later on if you make these changes.
Yeah. So here now we're back to master. Okay. Now should we open the Flutter framework package as if we're going to work on it?
Yes, because we have executed flutter dev pub-get, so our package is synchronized and it's ready to edit. So now we can open it. We can open this only package. A lot of people, what they do is they open the actual flutter dev folder. If you do that, you're not going to be able to sync your pub-get, pub-spec YAML. You should open the actual Flutter package inside your fork. So it uses the pub-spec YAML to sync it. It uses the Dart tool version to sync your project. And it is doing that right now. Like you're going to look at the bottom, it's analyzing the project.
Yep, doing that. So, and another thing to keep in mind. So Taha just pointed out that the kind of this automatic version number that we see here, you're not going to get that if you open the whole repository at one time. That's one problem. The other problem is that you can see, even just in this one package, our Android Studio is still analyzing files. It's taking a while. That's because there's a lot of stuff in the Flutter framework package, but there's way more stuff in the whole repository. If you open the whole repository, you're going to be sitting here all day waiting for analysis to finish. So you want to try to open one package at a time to minimize the amount of work that your IDE is doing.
That's right. In fact, this is the biggest package in the whole SDK. And it will only do that thing like one time. You won't do it most of the time. Because this is the first time we opened it and we synced with a new command, like we synced it for the first time. So now it is already done. So here you can see it's just like a regular package. It's just a regular pub-spec YAML that you would have in a sample project. You can see the Flutter SDK version the package is using, which Dart SDK version the package is using. You don't need to modify that, but you can see it's just a regular project. It's just a big regular project.
So here's the pub spec, and it's always fun to just see the name Flutter as the name of the project in the pub spec. Description, homepage like normal. Environment, you'll see that we're on 3.3.0. And dependencies. So apparently these are the only things that the Flutter framework itself depends on. It's a very small. It's funny that the average Flutter app has like 100 dependencies and Flutter itself has like 6 or 7. Of course, this dependency here, the engine, is a pretty big one. And then dev dependencies are things that only exist locally for you as a developer. Things like your testing frameworks here, test and Goldens, and then fake stuff for tests, all that kind of stuff. So lots of dev dependencies, but not many runtime dependencies.
Yeah. So here we are pretty much ready to do whatever we want, but it's important to know where you want to make the changes, which file you are interested in.
I think before we even try to make a little change, if one of the most common things to do when you pull down any open source package is two things: run build, run tests. Now, I don't actually know, I don't remember what running a build independently would do here, but certainly running tests are something that would be reasonable to do. What do we have to do to run the tests in the Flutter framework?
Before we run tests, we can actually look at the structure, because we can see that there is not just one test. There are several sections of tests. So if you we can go to lib folder first, just to see like what kind of source we have.
Yep.
So inside the lib folder, we have high level export file. I don't know what do we call it officially. I just see there are export files. And then there are subfolders for each category. So this Flutter package, basically the framework, it consisting of all the different subsections of framework. So it could be material, it could be Cupertino, it could be just widget. And each of these folders have more files in it. So we need to look at the actual top level. We can look at it here. You can see that it's a top level view of the same folders. And then when you go to test folder, you will see the same structure inside the test folders.
Yep. So here we have, and under test, we have Cupertino, we have material, we have gestures, foundation, all the same file directory names that we have up here, like Cupertino, material, gestures, foundation. Now that's, by the way, again, for those who haven't written a lot of tests, that's not required. The matching directories is not required by Dart or Flutter, but this is a chosen policy up to this point of the Flutter team, that in their test directory, they have chosen to have the same directories with the same names as their source code.
It is important because there are thousands of test files. So if you put them together in one test folder, it will be a really long folder, like huge folder. So this way, like, it makes it very easy for anybody to navigate your structure. So you mentioned running tests. So we can do we can test like a particular file, which I would recommend, rather than running the whole thing. It will take 30 minutes. On some machine, it could take like 40 minutes to run the whole test. But we can choose one file. So I want to show, like, when you navigate to this structure, there are so many things happening. And when you begin contributing for the first time, you see, oh, there are so many things. You will be daunted, but you need to not worry about that. You need to focus on what you are most interested in. So I would ask you to pick, because I work on materials, I would ask you to pick a random material widget, not in the test, go in the source class. I want to show something there. So pick a random widget from material. Okay. Because you can see there are so many material files, even just in material folder.
What do I want to test? Let's see. Let's test the floating action button.
Perfect. So here, this is the actual source class. This is what you typically would use to modify the widget. So this file, simply called floating action button.dart, has the actual widget, but it also has related code that makes floating action button. It just doesn't have just one widget. It might have several widgets. It might have classes. It might have enums. It might have functions. So this whole class is consisting of floating action button. But this file would also, of course, depend on other classes. So you can see like which classes are imported into this file. If you go to the top level, here you can see it imports the foundation for like the core widgets. It uses rendering package to import rendering widgets. It uses the widget package to import some of its widget. Then there are just, you can see there are some files that are without any package name. These are relative classes. They are inside the same material folder. So if you're importing a package that exists in a different, if you're importing a class that exists in a different package folder, in this case, foundation folder or widget folder, it's not inside material, you import the actual folder. But if the class is importing a relative file within the same material folder, you import only the classes. So here you can see it imports some common things that are common in other widgets too, like it imports color scheme. Import the theme class of this widget. some widgets have themes, so you need to import the theme to style that widget. So you can see when you run test, are you running tests for the widget or are you running tests for the widget theme? There is a big difference between them. And then there are some other common ones like theme.dart, theme data. And what I usually do is, when I run into a new class, which is rare, but when I run into a new class, I look at the imports. I look at how big this file is. So go all the way down, you can see how big this file is. So it tells you the scope you're working with. In this case, it is 842. Like it is relatively big, but not the biggest. There are bigger files than this. So now, let's just say I want to make sure that whatever changes, imagine I want to work on floating action button. I will run test for this widget. So I will go to the test file with the same corresponding name, floating action button dash test or underscore test.
Floating action button underscore test. Here we are.
Yes. So this file contains all the tests for the whole that you have just seen. And it has the main function, then it has several tests. It would have many more tests, and then it would have groups of tests. Some widgets have just tests, then some have group, and then inside the group you would have more tests. So you can see how big this file is. And I want to make sure that my changes that I would make in the future, I can run my tests before I make changes. And I can run tests after making changes. So if you want to run tests, let's run a test for floating action button.
Okay, now the way I usually run tests is I just specify the file from the terminal. Is that how you choose to do it, or do you use like IDE buttons in here to run your test suite?
I do both. It depends on the situation. I do both.
Okay. So let's see what test and we need the path to the file here.
Yeah, we can define it.
Material. And then floating action button test. Okay, and I'm going to press enter, and let's see what happens. Nope. Oh, sorry, I forgot the actual command. And again, this is how you run a test in literally every other Flutter project you've ever created.
Yes.
And there we go. So apparently that file contained 44 different tests. They all ran, they all passed. That's why it's plus 44 in green. And of course, all tests passed.
Perfect. So this tells you that everything is good because we haven't modified this class. But this is very important to test your class before you make changes. Then after you make changes, let's just say if it is a breaking change or a non-breaking change, you will run the test to verify that your changes are not breaking existing changes like other people have written in the source code class. Then you add your own test to verify the new changes.
Yeah,
so,
and the reason that you run it first is just to make sure that you can make sure, because if any of your configuration is off or anything weird is going on, it might not compile, or for some reason it might fail when it's supposed to pass. So first you run it to make sure it builds, it runs, it passes. Then you know you got a clean slate. Then you can go make your changes, and then you run the test again to make sure that your changes didn't break anything. Though I will point out one additional point. Just because you make a change in floating action button doesn't mean that you didn't break a bunch of other stuff outside of floating action button. We said floating action button depends on stuff, but also a bunch of other stuff depends on floating action button. So if you're doing some quick development, it's okay to just run that one file. But once you think you've made a meaningful change, you do need to run all the tests because all of them have to pass.
That's right. There are other tests too, like you need to test some other packages sometimes, like you might need to run Flutter localization if you're making changes to your class with the localization test. So there might be other scenarios. And sometimes what happens, it's very rare, but it happens. If you have, it's rare with me probably, but because we can't use that format to format the source class, you would have analyzation errors in the repository. When you file the PR, it will say you have trailing spaces, you have incorrect format, or you don't have proper comment or proper documentation. There could be other analyzation that will be caught later on. You can't possibly run those analyzation locally, but you would do your best to make sure, first of all, no other tests are failed. Like you said, like all the other tests are passing. and your changes are correct, everything is good, you remove trailing spaces. I can give some tips on how to remove trailing spaces. In fact, like there is the ID setting to remove trailing spaces. So you could just enable that. It will remove all the trailing spaces because Flutter does not tolerate trailing spaces. Most of the other repositories, especially in JavaScript, they don't really worry about trailing spaces, but Flutter does, and it will fail your analyzation.
Okay,
That's
so
right.
it looks like I already have that turned on for modified lines. We probably don't need it on for all lines, do we? Because that would change things that already existed, and if it already exists, it's supposed to be correct.
No, it's perfectly fine because when you make changes, you would have git changes for the particular lines, and it will automatically remove trailing spaces from those change lines.
And this is running on save, end of save, remove trailing blank lines. I guess this one should probably be on as well, right? Remove trailing blank lines at the end of, although actually, hold on a second. Because we were at the bottom of floating action button,
Yeah.
and that's a blank line. So it looks like, so Flutter may not allow spaces at the end of lines, but in fact, if I remember correctly, Flutter wants a blank line at the very end of the file, because I think historically that extra blank line is relevant to determining end of file. So
Not just Flutter, not just Flutter. Even GitHub would complain.
I mean, like from a historical operating system standpoint, I think having a blank line at the end of the file historically is important, even though modern systems don't require that. So I think because of that history, Flutter says, yeah, let's make sure we have a blank line at the end of the file too.
That's right.
So blank lines at the end are okay, just not, we wouldn't want extra spaces like this at the end of a line.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I think, so to help frame this, if there's any, I think what we want to do is create kind of a dividing point here between initial setup and build and run and test versus trying to make our first contribution. I think there's a good natural division there. I also think we've done a good amount of stuff today. So maybe let's try to wrap up this stage of the process, and hopefully we can come back sometime in the future and say, okay, now that we've got everything set up, we can try a contribution and see what that looks like, to look at an issue ticket, to put up a PR, to get it approved, all that stuff. We've run tests. That's great. What about, is there ever a need to actually build Flutter? Because we know Flutter has a binary. Do we ever actually build Flutter, or do we only write source code and then run tests?
We just write source code and run tests, because when you need to build, you're building with Flutter engine. That's where you need to build the engine and then use the command to run a custom engine. But with the framework, the best part, this is why I love working on framework, because you don't need to do all of that. You just edit code. You can instantly run the changes almost immediately. Like I have two IDEs sometimes. Like I would have two instances of VS Code side by side. One would make changes. I can switch to another window, click save or refresh. It will immediately show those changes. Sometimes you would have to run pubget just so it syncs parameters. Sometimes I've noticed that, but you don't need to build anything. It is like editing the source code. But if you do that with a stable version, or like you're not properly doing the whole setup that we have talked about, even if you make those changes, it will not reflect in your project. But the steps we have taken ensures that our sample project is using the correct Flutter dev version, and then whatever changes we make in the Flutter dev version are reflected in our sample project. If they don't do that, run Flutter dev pubget, and it will do that. It will reflect those changes immediately, as long as you're running the correct command. If you accidentally run Flutter pubget, you are using the wrong SDK, which is unmodified. It will not reflect those changes immediately.
Got it. Okay. And yes, building the engine is a much more convoluted and difficult process, and it takes a very long time, and it's a real pain. The engine, just so everyone understands, the engine is the part of the code base. It has the C code or C++. That's the stuff that talks to Skia for rendering, or Impeller is the new rendering engine. It's what talks to the Android code, the iOS code, like the actual the application code that's specific to the platform. It does contain a little bit of Dart code, and so if you ever actually find yourself needing to alter that Dart code, then you're stuck rebuilding the whole engine. but that's just kind of some specialized Dart code that's meant to integrate the framework with the engine. What we're dealing with in the framework, it's all Dart. The framework is all Dart, so it's easy to recompile the Dart. It's easy to run the Dart code, and that's why it's so convenient for us. So, okay.
That's right.
If you followed along at home, you are now ready to start contributing. Now, again, in the future, we do want to come back and talk about like, what does it look like to file an issue ticket or to assign yourself an issue ticket or to put up a PR? That's important stuff too for process. But you're technically now in a position where you can alter Flutter and you can make changes and you can offer those changes to the framework. As we close out that phase of discussion, Taha, are there any final points that you'd like to make about what we've done today and where we go from here?
I think the setup we have shown is just one way. You could use alias, you could use FPM, or you could have your own way, like you want to have a different system. If you have a spare computer that you use only for contribution, you're welcome to do that. You don't need to set alias or anything. Like if you have a personal machine where you don't need to really use a stable version, feel free to use just master branch, just to experiment, to see what are the latest changes in the Flutter SDK. And there are many ways to do this. This is just one way. This will ensure that you're not modifying your stable version and you're ready to contribute and test the changes. And you have also shown how to add upstream. So a later date, if you don't decide to contribute the day you set up your SDK, you can still use the setup to update it and then contribute in the later day, like a week or whatever in the future. But you're ready to sync your project, sync your SDK, test the changes, and run a sample to verify your changes are valid. In the future, we can talk about like what issues to pick and how to go about editing those files, running new tests. I could also give you tips on how to write tests for a particular change. And when you file a PR, you need to go through a checklist. So I can talk about the checklist to ensure that your PR gets you there like 99%. There could be like 1 or 2% chance it could have some issues, but you will be there ready to contribute with confidence.
All right, we had a few technical glitches there. Since we can't seem to get the audio to work consistently here, that's a forced ending point for us. So I do want to thank Taha for joining me today on this video. We look forward to more videos like this where we show you how to contribute effectively to Flutter so that more people in the community can help build and test and extend Flutter into the future. This series, again, is Building Flutter, brought to you by the Flutter Bounty Hunters. Subscribe to the channel so you can keep up to date with future videos like this, and also like and share so more people in the Flutter community are aware of how to actually contribute to Flutter. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.